The mansion had always been a place of order, pristine, calculated, and devoid of warmth. Michael liked it that way. It mirrored his life, structured, controlled, and efficient. But ever since Daisy arrived, there was a shift so subtle he almost didn't notice. The scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air longer than usual. The grand halls, once eerily silent, now carried the faint hum of an old melody, one that stirred something in the depths of his mind. Daisy never spoke more than necessary, but in her silence there was a presence that filled the empty spaces of the estate. She worked tirelessly, her every move precise, her posture always composed. Yet Michael sensed there was more to her than the role she played. Late at night, he had caught glimpses of her standing by the window, staring at the moon as if lost in a past only she could see. Something in that sight unsettled him, not in fear, but in recognition. One evening, as Michael walked through the dimly lit corridors, he overheard a soft sniffle coming from the parlor. He stopped, listening. The sound was faint, quickly stifled, but it was there, a quiet pain slipping through the cracks of Daisy's carefully guarded composure. For a moment, he considered stepping forward, saying something. But what would he even say? He wasn't the kind of man to pry into the personal lives of his employees. And yet a lingering thought refused to leave him. Why did her sadness feel so familiar? Shaking off the feeling, he turned away, convincing himself it was nothing. After all, he had spent years perfecting the art of ignoring emotions. But deep inside, something had already begun to unravel. Days turned into weeks, and the subtle changes in the mansion became harder for Michael to ignore. There was something about Daisy's presence that disrupted the sterile perfection of his world, not in a chaotic way, but in a way that made him question why it had ever been so empty to begin with. He found himself noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The way the sunlight streamed through the massive windows in the morning, the faint scent of lavender on freshly laundered sheets, the comforting rhythm of Daisy's footsteps as she moved through the halls. These small, almost insignificant details carried a warmth he hadn't realized he was missing. One evening, Michael returned home earlier than usual. The mansion, always quiet at that hour, held an unusual stillness. As he stepped inside, he caught sight of Daisy in the sitting room, carefully adjusting a framed photograph on a side table. He knew every decoration in that house, every carefully curated piece of art chosen for aesthetics rather than sentiment. But this frame, this wasn't his. He frowned, stepping closer. "What is that?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. Daisy stiffened, her fingers lingering on the glass before she slowly turned to face him. For the briefest moment, something flickered across her expression. Fear, hesitation, something unspoken. "It was misplaced," she said, barely above a whisper. Michael studied her, his sharp gaze moving between her face and the frame she had just positioned. It was an old black-and-white photograph, the edges worn, the image slightly faded. A young woman stood in the picture, holding the hand of a small child. There was something eerily familiar about the scene, something that stirred an unease in his chest. He reached for it before he could stop himself. The moment his fingers brushed against the frame, a shiver ran through him. That child, there was no mistaking it. It was him. Michael's breath caught in his throat. His entire life had been built on certainty, on facts, on a clear understanding of who he was and where he came from. But now, standing in his own home, staring at an image from a past he had long buried, he realized something terrifying. He didn't know everything after all, and Daisy, the woman who had entered his life so quietly, so unassumingly, might hold answers to questions he never thought to ask. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The photograph had unsettled him in a way he couldn't fully explain. He told himself it was a coincidence, an image from the past that happened to resemble him, nothing more. And yet, the more he tried to dismiss it, the more the questions gnawed at him. Who was the woman in the picture? How had it ended up in his home? And why had Daisy reacted the way she did? There was hesitation in her eyes, a reluctance he couldn't ignore. Daisy, for her part, continued her work with the same quiet efficiency, never giving Michael a reason to doubt her professionalism. But now he found himself watching her differently. He noticed the way she moved through the house, the way she lingered near certain rooms, as if drawn to them. She had a habit of straightening objects on the shelves, adjusting curtains just so, as if trying to preserve something that only she understood. It was as if she had been in that house before, long before she had ever been hired. The coincidences continued to pile up. One evening, Michael found an old music box in the study, one he hadn't seen in years. When he wound it up, the hauntingly familiar tune filled the room, sending a chill down his spine. He remembered it from his childhood, a melody that had played in the background of some of his earliest memories. And then, as he turned, he saw Daisy standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Beautiful song," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe even longing, before she turned and walked away. Michael's pulse quickened. He wasn't imagining things. Daisy knew more than she let on. He had spent years building his life on logic and control, but for the first time in a long time, he felt as though he was standing at the edge of something unknown. And no matter how much he tried to resist it, he knew one thing for certain. Daisy Miller was not just a housekeeper. She was a link to a past he had long forgotten. Michael had never been a man to dwell on the past. The very foundation of his success was built on discipline, forward thinking, and the ability to compartmentalize emotions. But ever since Daisy had arrived, the neatly organized compartments of his mind had begun to unravel. The small, almost imperceptible details, the photograph, the music box, the way she seemed to know the house better than any employee should, were beginning to form a pattern he couldn't ignore. The question was, did he really want to know the answers? Daisy, as always, remained reserved, but Michael started to notice the cracks in her composure. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, he caught her standing in front of the grand staircase, running her hand over the polished wood as if tracing a memory. Other times, she would pause in the hallway, staring at the family portraits that adorned the walls, her fingers tightening around the linens she carried. It was subtle, but it was there, an emotional connection to the house that she was desperately trying to suppress. One afternoon, Michael found himself drawn to the library, a place he rarely visited despite its grandeur. As he scanned the rows of books, his fingers brushed against a leather-bound album tucked away in the corner. He hesitated before pulling it out, dust motes swirling in the air as he opened the worn cover. Inside, faded photographs told the story of a family long before his time, black and white images of generations past. But then, midway through the album, he saw something that made his breath hitch. A picture of a woman, young and radiant, holding a child with strikingly familiar features. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. That child was him. The sound of footsteps behind him made him stiffen. He turned slowly, and there stood Daisy, her expression unreadable, but her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite decipher. "I was just tidying up," she said, her voice even, but her hands trembling slightly. Michael's grip on the album tightened. He had spent his life believing he knew where he came from, who he was, but now, staring at the woman before him, he began to wonder if his entire life had been built on a lie. Michael had always prided himself on his ability to read people. In the corporate world, instincts were everything, and he had built an empire on knowing when someone was hiding something. And now, standing face to face with Daisy, he knew, without a doubt, that she was keeping secrets. The question was, why? And more importantly, what did those secrets have to do with him? Daisy quickly composed herself, offering a polite smile as she reached for a feather duster resting on the bookshelf. "I should finish cleaning," she said softly, her voice carefully measured, but Michael wasn't fooled. He watched as she turned away, her posture rigid, her fingers gripping the duster just a little too tightly. He wanted to press her for answers, to demand she explain why his past seemed to linger in her eyes. But something told him that whatever truth she held, she wasn't ready to reveal it yet. Over the next few days, more small coincidences surfaced. A pendant she wore, a delicate locket she kept hidden beneath the collar of her uniform, caught the light one afternoon. For a brief second, Michael saw the engraving on its surface, a symbol that looked strikingly familiar. He didn't say anything, but the sight of it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Then there was the way she spoke to the other staff, always warm, always kind, but with a certain knowing, as if she had been in their shoes before, as if she understood their struggles on a personal level. Late one evening, as Michael sat alone in his study, he found himself staring at the photograph from the album once more. His fingers traced the edges, his mind racing with memories that now felt incomplete. The woman in the photo, his mother, or at least the woman he had always believed was his mother, had passed away years ago, but something wasn't adding up. And every time he tried to put the pieces together, they led him back to the same person, Daisy. Michael exhaled slowly, setting the photo down. He wasn't a man prone to sentimentality, nor was he the type to chase ghosts from the past. But something told him that if he wanted answers, he was going to have to break his own rules. Because Daisy Miller wasn't just a housekeeper, she was a puzzle he was no longer willing to ignore. Michael had never been one to let emotions cloud his judgment, but the weight of uncertainty was becoming impossible to ignore. He found himself lingering in places he once passed through without a second thought, examining old photographs, running his hands over furniture that had stood in the mansion for decades, searching for something he couldn't quite name. And every time, his mind circled back to Daisy. She was at the heart of all these strange coincidences, yet she remained just out of reach, a locked door he didn't yet have the key to open. One evening, after another restless day filled with unanswered questions, Michael found himself in the attic, a space he hadn't set foot in for years. The air was thick with dust, the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories filling his lungs. He had no clear purpose for being there, only an instinctive pull that told him he was meant to find something. He rummaged through old trunks, flipping through brittle pages of letters long abandoned, until his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. A medallion, tarnished with time, yet still intact, its intricate design unfamiliar, except for the faint engraving on the back, a set of initials that sent a shiver down his spine. Before he could process the discovery, a soft gasp behind him made him turn sharply. Daisy stood at the entrance, her expression frozen in a mixture of shock and sorrow. Her eyes flicked from Michael's hand to the medallion, and in that instant he saw it, the undeniable recognition in her gaze. She knew what it was. She knew what it meant, and for the first time Michael was certain. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a part of his story, a fragment of a past that had been carefully hidden. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Daisy opened her mouth as if to speak, but then she hesitated, her lips pressing together as if she were fighting an internal battle. Michael took a step forward, his voice low but firm. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Who are you, really?" The question lingered in the air between them, and as Daisy's shoulders tensed, he knew whatever answer she had been avoiding, whatever secrets she had been keeping, it was time for them to come to light. Daisy's breath hitched at Michael's words, her fingers clutching the edge of the doorway as if steadying herself. For a moment she looked as though she might turn and leave, retreating as she had always done when the past threatened to surface. But something in Michael's eyes kept her rooted in place. There was no accusation in his gaze, only a quiet, unwavering determination. He wasn't demanding answers out of anger. He was searching for something only she could give him. Her gaze drifted back to the medallion in his hand. That small piece of metal held a lifetime of memories, a painful reminder of everything she had lost, everything she had tried to bury. She had thought she could stay in the shadows, remain invisible, quietly existing in the periphery of his life. But now, standing before the son she had abandoned, she realized that silence was no longer an option. Michael watched the emotions flicker across her face. Fear, sadness, resignation. She was on the edge of telling him something. He could feel it. But before she could say a word, she took a slow, shuddering breath and shook her head. "It's just an old piece of jewelry," she murmured, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Michael clenched his jaw, frustration rising. He had spent his entire life believing he knew who he was, where he came from. But now, the past was unraveling before him, piece by piece, and the one person who had the answers refused to speak. "Daisy," he said, his voice softer this time, "I don't believe in coincidences, and neither do you." He stepped closer, holding up the medallion. "This belongs to you, doesn't it? And somehow it's connected to me." Daisy's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. Instead, she turned her gaze to the window, her shoulders sinking under the weight of a truth too heavy to carry alone. Michael could see it now. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She wasn't just someone passing through his life. She was a link to something deeper, something that had been hidden for far too long. And whether she was ready or not, the truth was beginning to surface. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of unspoken truths pressed between them. Michael's grip on the medallion tightened. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe a quiet confession, a slip of the tongue that would confirm the growing suspicion gnawing at him. But Daisy remained frozen, her gaze distant, as if she were standing not in the attic of his mansion, but in the past, reliving something only she could see. "You knew my mother, didn't you?" Michael's voice was quieter now, but no less firm. He wasn't accusing her. He was giving her a chance to speak, to fill in the missing pieces before he was forced to find them on his own. The question hung in the air like a challenge, daring her to deny it. Daisy exhaled slowly, her shoulders trembling as she turned toward him. "I did," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, Michael knew this was more than just a passing acquaintance. There was grief in her expression, regret woven into every careful movement she made. "She was someone very important to me." Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. The way Daisy said it, the way her voice wavered, it wasn't just familiarity. It was something deeper, something personal. His mind raced, threading through the fragments of memories he had of his childhood, the hazy recollections of lullabies, warm hands tucking him into bed, a presence that had once been there but had long since faded. Could it be possible? Could the woman standing before him, the housekeeper he had barely noticed at first, be more than what she seemed? He took a step closer, his voice thick with emotion. "Who are you, Daisy?" he asked again, this time knowing the answer would change everything. Daisy swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She hesitated for only a second before whispering, "I'm someone who should have never left." Michael's world tilted. The air between them crackled with the weight of revelation, and for the first time in his life, he realized that the past he had so neatly constructed might have been a lie all along. Michael stood frozen, Daisy's words reverberating through his mind. "I'm someone who should have never left." The air in the attic felt heavier now, thick with memories he couldn't grasp. He had spent his entire life believing in a version of his past that now felt like a fragile illusion, one that Daisy Miller, his housekeeper, his mystery, had just shattered with a single sentence. He took a slow, measured breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "What do you mean by that?" His voice was steady, but beneath it lay a quiet urgency, a need for the truth he had never felt before. But Daisy didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze to the dust-covered trunks, the forgotten relics of another era, as if seeking refuge in the past before she could face the present. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet." Her voice wavered, a plea hidden within the restraint. Michael felt his frustration rising. He had spent years demanding clarity in business, never tolerating half-truths. And yet, here he was, standing before a woman who clearly held the answers to his very identity, only to be met with secrecy once again. Michael clenched his jaw, forcing himself to rein in his impatience. "Daisy, I don't need riddles. I need answers," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. "If you know something about my past, if you knew my mother, then I deserve to know the truth." His voice softened slightly, a rare vulnerability creeping in. Was she hiding something from me? Daisy's shoulders sagged, her silence speaking volumes. She closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering the courage to say what had been buried for years. When she finally looked at him, her expression was one of sorrow and guilt. "Your mother never wanted to leave you in the dark," she whispered. She wanted to protect you." Michael's breath hitched. Protect him from what? And more importantly, why was Daisy the one carrying the weight of that decision? Michael's patience was wearing thin, but for the first time in his life, he felt something deeper than frustration. Fear. Fear that whatever Daisy was about to reveal would dismantle the foundation of everything he had built, everything he thought he knew about himself. His fists clenched at his sides as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "Protect me from what?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with desperation. Daisy looked away, her fingers trembling as she clasped them together. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. "From a past that wasn't meant to find you," she finally admitted, "from a truth that could have changed your life before you were ready to face it." She exhaled shakily and took a hesitant step forward. "Your mother, she carried a burden. One that She hesitated, closing her eyes briefly before correcting herself. "One that we tried to shield you from." Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. "We." The word wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. Daisy was intricately woven into the fabric of his past, whether she wanted to be or not. He had spent years believing his childhood was defined by privilege and structure, untouched by turmoil. But what if that had been a carefully crafted illusion? His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "Who are you to me, Daisy?" The question lingered, thick with meaning. He was no longer asking as a businessman analyzing a problem. He was asking as a man searching for the missing pieces of his own life. Daisy's lips parted, but instead of an answer, she lifted her shaking hands to the locket around her neck. For a moment she hesitated, then slowly unclasped it. The delicate chain slipped through her fingers as she held the locket out to him. "You need to see this," she whispered. Michael took it carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs. The locket was worn with age, but as he pried it open, his breath caught in his throat. Inside, two tiny photographs rested, one of a young woman and the other of a baby. A baby with the same piercing eyes he saw in the mirror every day. Michael's world tilted as he stared at the tiny photograph inside the locket. The baby's eyes, his eyes, stared back at him, frozen in time. His fingers tightened around the delicate piece of jewelry, his pulse pounding in his ears. He looked up at Daisy, searching her face for denial, for an explanation that made sense. But there was none, only quiet resignation, as if she had spent years preparing for this moment, knowing it was inevitable. His throat was dry when he finally spoke. "This is me." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of realization, of truth settling into the cracks of his once certain past. Daisy gave a slow nod, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Pain, regret, love, maybe all of them. Michael felt his grip on reality loosening. "Why do you have this?" His voice was hoarse, edged with disbelief. "Why would she carry a picture of me in a locket unless—" The thought struck him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. His mind reeled, grasping at memories that had once seemed insignificant. His mother's hushed tones when he asked about his early years, the way she had avoided speaking of his father, the inexplicable feeling of absence he had never been able to explain. Daisy inhaled sharply, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Because I've carried you with me every day of my life, she whispered. Because no matter how much time passed, no matter how much I tried to stay away, I could never let you go. Michael staggered back a step, the weight of her words crushing down on him. You... His voice faltered, barely able to form the words. His chest tightened, every instinct telling him that the truth was standing right in front of him. Undeniable. Daisy took a tentative step closer. Michael, I'm your mother. The words shattered the last of his defenses. His world, once built on structure and certainty, crumbled beneath him. Everything he thought he knew, his childhood, his family, his very identity, had been rewritten in an instant. And standing before him was the woman who had been a ghost in his life, finally stepping into the light. Michael felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath him. His breath came in shallow bursts as Daisy's words echoed in his mind. I'm your mother. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. His mother had died when he was young. He had spent his entire life believing that, and yet here she stood, not a stranger, not just a housekeeper, but the woman who had given him life. He turned away, his thoughts tangled in a storm of disbelief and betrayal. No, he murmured, more to himself than to her. This doesn't make sense. The locket in his hand felt heavier now, an anchor dragging him into a reality he wasn't ready to accept. He had spent his life meticulously crafting his identity, who he was, where he came from. And now, in an instant, all of it had been rewritten. Daisy watched him, her expression pained but unwavering. I never wanted to leave you, Michael, she said softly, her voice laced with regret. I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped loving you. But she hesitated, as if the words physically hurt to say. I had no choice. Michael turned sharply, his jaw clenched. No choice. His voice was tight, controlled, but beneath it was a fire of emotions threatening to break free. You had a choice. You could have stayed. You could have... He stopped himself, shaking his head. Anger and confusion warred within him, each one fighting for dominance. Why now? Why after all these years? Daisy swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached for the chair beside her, as if she needed something to hold on to. Because the truth was never meant to stay buried forever, she whispered. And because no matter how much time passes, some bonds can never be broken. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to deny it, to push her words away, to cling to the version of his life that had made sense, but deep down, in a place he had long ignored, something inside him knew. This wasn't a lie. This was the truth he had spent his entire life unknowingly searching for. Michael paced the length of the study, his mind racing. The walls of his carefully constructed life were collapsing around him, and he had no idea how to rebuild them. Daisy, his mother, stood a few feet away, waiting for him to speak, to react, to do anything but retreat into silence. But how was he supposed to process this? His entire existence had been based on a lie, and the woman standing before him was the key to unlocking a past he had never even questioned. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. If you never stopped loving me, if you never forgot me, he said, his voice raw, then why did you leave? The words carried a sharp edge, one that cut deep, even as he spoke them. He wasn't sure if he was angry, heartbroken, or just lost. Maybe all three. Daisy's lips trembled, and for the first time, tears welled in her eyes. Because I thought it was the only way to give you a better life, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. There were circumstances, things I can't change, mistakes I made. She hesitated, then took a breath as if steadying herself. But leaving you was never about not wanting you. It was about protecting you. Michael let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Protecting me from what? From you? The words felt foreign even as he said them. She left to protect me. But from what? A memory from his childhood surfaced, his mother's face shadowed with worry, always looking over her shoulder as if expecting something to go wrong. Was it paranoia, or had there been a real danger? And why had he never questioned it before? Daisy wiped a tear from her cheek and met his gaze. "From a life that would have destroyed us both," she said, "and from secrets that were never meant to reach you." Michael's breath caught. There was more to this, more than just abandonment, more than just regret. His past was a puzzle, and he was beginning to realize that Daisy held the final pieces. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears as Daisy's words settled over him. Secrets that were never meant to reach you. His entire life he had believed in hard facts, intangible truths. But now, standing in the presence of a mother he had thought long dead, he realized how little he actually knew about his own story. His voice was low, almost hesitant. What secrets? He watched Daisy closely, noting the way her fingers trembled as she clutched the locket at her chest, as if drawing strength from the tiny object that had connected them even in separation. She took a shaky breath. "Your father," she whispered, her voice laced with something between sorrow and fear. "He wasn't the man you were told he was." Her gaze flickered up to meet his, searching for understanding. He was powerful, yes, but dangerous. "I knew that if I stayed, if I raised you in his shadow, you would have been trapped in a life you never asked for." Michael's stomach tightened. His father, the man whose legacy he had carried with pride, was now being painted as a threat. "Are you saying he—" He stopped, unable to form the words. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to the man's name, building his empire in his image. Could it really be true that the man he had idolized had been the very reason his mother had disappeared? Daisy nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "I tried to take you with me. I tried to run," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But they wouldn't let me. I was forced to leave, to disappear, to watch from a distance as you were raised in a world I had desperately wanted to save you from." She wiped at her eyes and inhaled deeply. "And now, Michael, now you deserve to know everything." Michael swallowed hard, his mind spinning. His life had been built on illusions, on half-truths told to protect him from a past that was now clawing its way to the surface. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. Michael had spent his life in control. He built his empire on logic, discipline, and an unshakable belief that he knew who he was. But now, that certainty was crumbling. His mother, Daisy, stood before him, unraveling a past he had never dared to question. And worse, her revelations about his father planted a seed of doubt that threatened everything he had built. He took a slow, measured breath, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "You're telling me," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "that my entire life has been a lie, that the man I've spent years trying to live up to was dangerous?" The word felt foreign on his tongue. He had admired his father, modeled himself after him, even followed in his footsteps. To hear Daisy describe him as someone to escape from, it was almost unbearable. Daisy's eyes softened, but she didn't retreat. She had carried this truth for too long to turn back now. "I know it's hard to hear, Michael," she said gently. "But you need to understand. Your father was powerful, but power without conscience is dangerous. I saw things no mother would ever want her child to witness." She swallowed hard, as if the memories still haunted her. "I left because I had no other choice. And now, after all these years, I need you to see the truth for yourself." Michael clenched his jaw, his emotions warring between disbelief and something far more dangerous: recognition. Hadn't he always felt the weight of his father's name pressing down on him? Hadn't he, even in the height of his success, sensed that something was missing? The truth was like a splinter in his mind, painful and impossible to ignore. His voice dropped, steady but laced with steel. "Then tell me everything," he said. "No more half-truths, no more secrets." He met Daisy's gaze, his own filled with a determination that left no room for avoidance. "I want to know exactly what he did." Daisy inhaled sharply, her grip tightening around the edge of the table as if bracing herself. "Then you need to be prepared, Michael," she warned, "because once you hear the truth, there's no going back." Dasham, Michael's pulse pounded as he braced himself for the truth. He had demanded answers, but now that he stood on the precipice of revelation, a part of him wasn't sure he was ready. Yet there was no turning back. The past had finally caught up with him, and whatever Daisy was about to say would change everything. Daisy exhaled slowly, her eyes clouded with old pain. "Your father wasn't just a businessman, Michael," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was ruthless. He controlled people, not just with money, but with fear. There were deals made behind closed doors, alliances built on manipulation, and consequences for anyone who dared to cross him." She hesitated, as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. "And I was one of those consequences." Michael's stomach tightened. His father had always been a formidable figure, a man who commanded respect in every room he entered. But Daisy's words painted a different picture, one of intimidation, of control. He struggled to reconcile this version of the man with the father he had idolized. "What did he do to you?" His voice was quiet, but laced with barely restrained tension. Daisy's fingers brushed over the locket at her chest, the pain evident in her expression. "He didn't love me, Michael," she said. "Not in the way a man should love the mother of his child. To him, I was a mistake, an inconvenience. And when I tried to leave, to take you with me, he made sure I couldn't." She closed her eyes for a moment before looking back at him. "I was threatened, forced to disappear. I was given no choice but to leave you behind." Michael felt his chest constrict, a mixture of rage and sorrow crashing over him. He had spent his whole life believing his mother was gone, when in reality she had been torn away from him. And all this time, his father had let him believe otherwise. "He told me you died," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The lie stung more than he expected. His fists clenched at his sides. "He let me grieve for you. He let me grow up thinking you had abandoned me." Daisy stepped closer, her eyes pleading. "I never wanted to leave you, Michael, but I was young and powerless against him. If I had stayed, he would have destroyed me, and I was terrified he'd do the same to you." Michael's breath came in short bursts, the realization pressing down on him. His father, the man he had admired, had built his legacy on deceit. His childhood, his entire existence, had been shaped by a lie. And now, standing before the woman who had risked everything to protect him, he felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't ignore. Michael felt as if the walls of the mansion were closing in on him. His breath was heavy, his mind racing through memories that now felt distorted, tainted by the truth Daisy had just revealed. Every moment of his childhood, every lesson, every word his father had spoken was suddenly cast in a different light. And all this time, the woman who had given him life had been forced to watch from a distance, powerless to change his fate. His hands curled into fists as he fought the anger rising within him. "Why didn't you come back?" The question was raw, laced with pain he hadn't even realized was buried inside him. If he was gone, if nothing was stopping you, why did you wait so long? He knew his voice was sharp, but he couldn't help it. He had been denied the truth for too long, and now it was suffocating him. Daisy flinched slightly, but she didn't look away. She met his gaze with unwavering honesty. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that you would hate me. Afraid that you wouldn't believe me. And most of all, afraid that I had lost you forever." Her voice trembled, but her resolve remained strong. "I stayed in the shadows, watching from afar, convincing myself that you were better off without me, that you had built a life that didn't need me in it." Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry. Part of him wanted to lash out, to tell her that she had no right to decide what was best for him. But another part, one buried deep beneath years of detachment, understood. He had spent so long ignoring the ache in his heart, convincing himself that he was whole, that his success was enough. But now, as he stood before his mother for the first time in decades, he felt the weight of what he had lost. Silence stretched between them, thick with emotion. Then, In a moment of quiet vulnerability, Daisy whispered, "I know I can't change the past, Michael. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be a part of your future." Her voice was filled with hope, with fear, with the desperate plea of a mother who had been waiting for redemption. Michael inhaled sharply, his chest tight with emotions he didn't yet have the words for. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily, the wounds of the past wouldn't heal overnight. But as he looked into Daisy's tear-filled eyes, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he had a choice. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face the future alone. Michael barely slept that night. The weight of Daisy's confession sat heavy on his chest, pressing down with every breath. He had spent his entire life believing his mother had died, mourning a loss that had never even been real, and now, in the span of a single evening, everything had changed. The woman he thought he had lost had never truly been gone. She had been forced into the shadows, watching his life unfold from a painful distance. The next morning, he found himself standing by the large window of his study, staring out at the sprawling estate he had built, his empire, his sanctuary. But now, it felt different, hollow. The walls, once symbols of success and power, now seemed to echo with the ghosts of the past. He gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady himself. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Catherine, the mansion's longtime manager and his most trusted confidant, stepped inside, her expression gentle but concerned. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice careful, as if she already knew the storm raging inside him. "Do you want to talk about it?" Michael exhaled sharply. "I don't even know where to begin." His voice was rough with exhaustion. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. "Everything I believed about my past, it was all a lie. My father, my mother, I don't even know what's real anymore." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with turmoil. "How am I supposed to process this?" Catherine walked closer, her gaze steady. "By allowing yourself to feel it," she said simply. "You've spent years burying emotions under work, under control, but this isn't something you can push away. It's your story, Michael. And whether you're ready or not, it's time to face it." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had spent his life outrunning the ghosts of his past, but now they had finally caught up to him, and for the first time he wasn't sure he had the strength to outrun them anymore. Michael turned away from Catherine's steady gaze, staring out at the vast estate once more. The silence of the morning stretched around him, but inside his mind was anything but quiet. Every memory he had of his childhood felt tainted now, like a painting whose colors had been altered without him realizing. He had lived in his father's shadow, striving to uphold his legacy, believing in the image of a man who had shaped him. And yet, that image had been built on deception. Catherine's voice was calm but insistent. "You don't have to figure everything out today, Michael, but you do have to decide. Will you let this truth break you, or will you let it reshape you?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Because whether you admit it or not, you've been searching for something your entire life. Maybe this is it." Michael let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "And what if I don't want it?" he muttered. "What if knowing the truth just makes everything worse?" He clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "She says she left to protect me, but what about all the years I spent wondering why she wasn't there? What about the emptiness I had to live with?" His voice cracked slightly, the rawness of his emotions slipping through. Catherine didn't flinch. She had known him long enough to recognize when he was fighting a battle with himself. "Then ask her, Michael," she said gently. "Not as the woman who turned your life upside down, but as the mother who's standing here now, trying to make things right." Michael exhaled sharply, pressing his fingers against the desk. He had spent years convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that the past was just a distant shadow. But now, it stood before him, refusing to be ignored. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to push it away anymore. The weight of Catherine's words settled over Michael, like a heavy fog. Then ask her. It sounded so simple, yet nothing about this situation was simple. He had spent his entire life building walls, shielding himself from the vulnerability of needing anyone. And now, the one person he had long convinced himself was gone was here, waiting, hoping for a chance he wasn't sure he could give. Later that evening, Michael found himself outside Daisy's quarters, his hand hovering over the door handle. He had faced ruthless competitors, multi-million-dollar deals, and high-stakes decisions without hesitation. Yet, standing here, confronting the past, felt more terrifying than any boardroom battle. Taking a breath, he knocked. The door opened slowly, and Daisy stood before him, her expression guarded but hopeful. She looked tired, as if the weight of the years apart had finally caught up to her. "Michael," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. The small room was simple, nothing like the grandeur of the mansion. It was a stark contrast to the life he lived, yet something about it felt real, untouched by the illusions that had surrounded him for so long. Michael remained standing, his hands in his pockets, his emotions a tangled mess. "I need to understand," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not just why you left, but why you stayed away for so long. Why now? Why come back?" He wasn't sure if his words carried anger or just deep, unresolved hurt. Maybe both. Daisy exhaled, clasping her hands together. "Because I couldn't stay away anymore," she admitted. "Because I was tired of watching from the outside, hoping that one day you would find the truth on your own. And because I wanted to give you the chance to know me, not as a secret, not as a regret, but as your mother." Her voice broke slightly, the weight of years spent in silence pressing down on her. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Michael, but I had to try." The words hit him harder than he expected. Forgiveness. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that, but as he looked into Daisy's eyes, so much like his own, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to stop running from the truth. Michael sat in silence, the weight of Daisy's words lingering in the air between them. He had spent his life mastering control, yet here he was, faced with something he couldn't manipulate or undo. His own history, rewritten before his very eyes. Forgiveness wasn't a decision he could make in an instant, but as he looked at the woman who had risked everything to tell him the truth, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe he didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe for the first time, it was enough to just try. Daisy sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, as if bracing for whatever response he might give. "I don't expect things to go back to how they could have been," she said carefully. I want to know you, Michael. Not as the boy I had to leave behind, but as the man you became." There was no desperation in her voice, no attempt to force his forgiveness, only a quiet plea for a second chance. Michael exhaled, running a hand over his face. Could he do this? Could he allow himself to rebuild something he had never even realized was missing? The years of anger, confusion, and hurt wouldn't just disappear, but deep down, beneath all of it, was something undeniable. Daisy had chosen to come back. She could have stayed in the shadows, carried her secrets to the grave, but she hadn't, and that had to mean something. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice low. "I don't know how to be a son to someone I've spent my life believing was gone." The words felt foreign, raw, but they were the closest thing to the truth he could give. Daisy's lips trembled, but she nodded. "Then let's figure it out together," she said softly. "One step at a time." Michael didn't respond right away, but for the first time since this all began, he felt the smallest crack in the walls he had built around himself. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't closure, but it was something, and for now, that was enough. The following days were filled with an uneasy yet undeniable shift in the atmosphere of the mansion. The once rigid routine of Michael's life had been disrupted, not by chaos, but by something far more unfamiliar, possibility. For the first time in years, he wasn't consumed by work or the relentless pursuit of success. Instead, his mind was occupied by something much more personal, the tentative, fragile process of reconnecting with the mother he never knew he still needed. Daisy remained careful with her presence, never overstepping, never forcing conversation. She simply was, quietly existing within the house that had once been nothing more than her place of work. But now, it was different. She had a reason to be here beyond duty. And Michael, though hesitant, found himself noticing the way she carried herself differently, as if allowing herself to belong in a way she never had before. One evening, Michael found himself lingering in the dining room longer than usual after dinner. It had always been a formal, silent affair, just him, his meal, and the distant hum of the staff going about their work. But tonight, Daisy stood at the far end of the room, wiping down the table as if she had done it 1,000 times before. And maybe she had. "You don't have to do that," Michael said suddenly, surprising even himself. Daisy paused, glancing at him with a small, knowing smile. "I know," she replied, continuing to wipe the surface with slow, deliberate movements. "Old habits, I suppose." Michael studied her for a moment, then exhaled, pushing his chair back. "Would you sit with me?" The words felt foreign coming from him, but he didn't regret them. Daisy hesitated, as if weighing whether to accept. But then she nodded. She set the cloth aside and took the seat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something new, an unspoken understanding that neither of them knew how to do this, but that they were trying nonetheless. Michael glanced at her, his voice quieter than before. "Tell me about my mother," he said. And for the first time, he wasn't referring to the version of her he had been told about. He was asking about her. Daisy's eyes glistened with emotion, but she smiled. "Where do I even begin?" And just like that, a door had opened between them. Daisy hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. Then her smile softened, and she looked at Michael with the tenderness of a mother who had spent years longing for this moment. "You were always curious as a child," she began, her voice carrying the weight of memories long buried. "You used to ask 100 questions about everything. Why the sky was blue, why the rain smelled different on warm days, why the stars didn't fall from the sky." She chuckled softly. "You drove me mad with your endless wondering, but I loved every second of it." Michael listened intently, absorbing her words like a story he had never heard before, yet somehow recognized. It was strange to hear details of himself from someone who had been absent for so long. He had spent years believing no one truly knew him, that his past was a puzzle with missing pieces he could never retrieve. But now, Daisy was handing them back to him, one memory at a time. "You were fearless," she continued, her fingers tracing the grain of the table. "I remember you climbing the tallest tree in our yard when you were barely 5 years old. I nearly had a heart attack, but you just laughed, telling me you wanted to see the world from up high." Her voice broke slightly, and she looked down, as if suddenly aware of how much time had slipped between then and now. "I lost those moments with you, Michael, and I'll never get them back, but if you'll let me, I'd like to be here for the ones still ahead." Michael swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. A part of him still resisted, still held on to the hurt of abandonment, the years spent believing a lie. But another part, the part that had longed for connection, for family, was tired of carrying that weight. Finally, he nodded. "I don't know how this is supposed to work," he admitted. "I don't know how to just—" He exhaled, shaking his head. "But I think I'd like to try." Daisy let out a quiet breath, as if she had been holding it all this time. She smiled, blinking back the tears threatening to spill. "That's all I could ever ask for." For the first time in a long time, Michael felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. It wasn't certainty or control or even clarity. It was peace. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Michael had always believed that change was something he controlled. In business, in life, in the way he structured his world, he dictated the terms. But as he sat in his study, staring out at the sprawling estate, he realized that real change, the kind that mattered, wasn't something you planned. It arrived unexpectedly, upending everything you thought you knew, forcing you to see the world through a different lens. Daisy's presence in his life had done exactly that. At first, it had felt like an invasion, a disruption of the careful order he had created. But now, he saw it for what it truly was, a second chance. A chance to reclaim something he had been denied for so long. He wasn't naive enough to believe that years of distance and hurt could be erased overnight, but for the first time, he was willing to take the first step forward. The mansion, once a symbol of success and solitude, was beginning to feel different. The spaces that had once felt cold and impersonal were now filled with quiet moments of reconciliation, simple conversations over breakfast, shared glances that spoke of understanding, the soft sound of Daisy humming a tune from long ago as she moved through the halls. They weren't grand gestures, but they were real, and in many ways, they mattered more than anything money could buy. One afternoon, Michael found himself in the kitchen, an unfamiliar place for him. Daisy stood by the counter, kneading dough with practiced hands, her movements slow and deliberate. He watched in silence for a moment before stepping forward. "I don't think I've ever made bread in my life," he admitted, his tone light but sincere. Daisy glanced at him, surprised before offering a small smile. "There's a first time for everything," she said, motioning for him to join her. As he hesitantly rolled up his sleeves and placed his hands on the dough, he realized something profound. He had spent years chasing an empire, but in this moment, in the warmth of the kitchen, with flour dusting his fingertips and the scent of something familiar filling the air, he felt richer than he ever had before. Michael fumbled with the dough, his movements stiff and uncertain. The sensation was foreign. He was used to handling contracts, not flour. Daisy chuckled softly, watching his struggle with the same patience a mother would have for a child learning something new. "Relax," she said, guiding his hands gently. "It's not about perfection. It's about feeling it, understanding the process." Michael exhaled, letting himself ease into the moment. He had spent his life chasing efficiency, precision, and results. But here, in the simplicity of kneading dough, there was no rush, no pressure, just the quiet comfort of shared time. He glanced at Daisy, realizing how easily she fit into this space, how natural it felt to be beside her, even after all the lost years. "Did you always like baking?" he asked after a moment. Daisy nodded, a distant look in her eyes. "It was something my mother taught me," she said. "Whenever life felt overwhelming, I'd find peace in the kitchen. There's something grounding about making something with your hands, something that nourishes others." She paused, offering a small smile. "I used to bake for you too when you were little. You had such a sweet tooth." Michael stilled. He had no memory of it, yet the thought stirred something deep inside him. He wondered how many small, precious moments like this had been lost to time. How many meals, bedtime stories, quiet reassurances had been stolen from them both. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the memories he had forgotten or the ones he had never been given the chance to make. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the sudden heaviness in his chest. "Well," he said, forcing a small smirk, "I wouldn't mind being spoiled with fresh bread now." Daisy laughed, her eyes twinkling. "You sound just like you did when you were a boy." The words warmed something inside him. For the first time, he didn't resist them. Instead, he let them settle, let them carve out a space in the walls he had spent years fortifying. He didn't know what the future held for them, but right now, in the quiet hum of the kitchen, he knew one thing. He didn't want to lose any more time. The days that followed were unlike any Michael had known before. His life had always been about transactions, deals, numbers, negotiations, but now something had shifted. Conversations with Daisy became more frequent, effortless even. He found himself seeking her out, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. There was something undeniably comforting about her presence, a quiet warmth that had been missing from his life for far too long. The mansion, once a symbol of power and solitude, no longer felt so empty. Small, seemingly insignificant moments took on a deeper meaning, sharing morning coffee, exchanging memories that had once been locked away, walking the vast gardens where Daisy spoke of the past with soft reverence. Michael listened, truly listened, to the life she had lived without him. And for the first time, instead of resenting what had been lost, he chose to focus on what they still had. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, a comfortable silence settled between them. The sky was streaked with hues of orange and violet, the air carrying the faint scent of jasmine. Michael glanced at Daisy, noting the way her expression had softened, how she seemed at peace in a way she hadn't before. "I spent so many years convincing myself I didn't need family," he admitted, his voice quiet, "that I was fine on my own." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "But I was wrong." He turned to face her, meeting her gaze. "I don't want to waste any more time, Daisy." Her lips trembled as she reached for his hand, her touch hesitant at first, then firm. "Neither do I," she whispered. Michael squeezed her hand gently. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds to heal, bridges to rebuild. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing success or control. He was chasing connection. And as he sat beside his mother, watching the stars blink to life in the darkening sky, he realized something profound. This wasn't just a reconciliation. It was a beginning. Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes the people we think we've lost return in ways we never expected. Michael Thompson spent years believing he knew his past, only to discover that the truth had been hidden from him all along. But instead of letting that truth destroy him, he made a choice to heal, to reconnect, and to embrace the family he never knew he still had. This story isn't just about Michael and Daisy, it's about all of us. How often do we hold on to anger when what we really need is understanding? How many times do we let the past define us instead of using it to shape a better future? Maybe like Michael, you felt the sting of betrayal, the pain of abandonment. But what if, instead of letting those wounds fester, you took a step toward healing, toward reconciliation, toward love, toward a fresh start? The past cannot be changed, but the future is still unwritten. Will you choose to let go of resentment and embrace second chances? Will you have the courage to rebuild the bonds that truly matter? If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on your own life, then don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment of reconciliation? What would you do if you were in Michael's shoes? Let's start a conversation. And if you want more stories of overcoming adversity, emotional transformation, and the power of family, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring narrative again. Because at the end of the day, we all have a story. And sometimes the hardest chapters lead to the most beautiful endings.